Hey guys, Nike here. I want to do a video today discussing Griever stats from the new Path of Fire expansion. I get asked about Griever stats multiple times every day that I stream, and a lot of times in a lot of comments on YouTube. And most of the questions are people hoping that Griever stats will be the key that unlocks some new hybrid build style, or the method by which a previously non-meta build could suddenly become meta. Unfortunately, Grievers isn't quite that magical, but it does have some uses. I want to discuss where Grievers is useful and why, and more importantly, where it's not useful and why not. First, let's talk about what Grievers is not. Grievers is not a replacement for Berserker gear. Imagine your DPS as a pie chart. Let's say with no gear equipped, you do about 80% of your damage in a particular build as power and 20% as condi. Stats are linear, multiplicative, and limited. If you dedicate 10% of your gear stats to power, it will increase the damage of the 80% slice of the pie by 10%. If you allocate 10% of the gear stats to condi, it will increase the 20% condi portion of the pie by 10%. 10% of 80 is a bigger number than 10% of 20. So as you can see, it doesn't make sense for a build that is mostly power with a splash of condi to dedicate any of their stats to condi damage. A lot of people have asked me if Power Hollowsmith is good, and my response has been it's a bit underpowered compared to the other POF specs at the moment. Their next question, without fail, has been consistently, well, what about with Grievers? This shows a fundamental lack of understanding the point I just talked about. If Power Hollowsmith isn't getting it done, lowering its power output to buff its smaller condi output isn't going to improve matters. In fact, it will significantly lower the DPS. Grievers is not a replacement for Viper's gear. If you currently have a meta condi build geared, you will not increase your DPS by swapping out the Viper's gear for Grievers. Most people think that's probably pretty obvious, but for a condi build that needs expertise is going to be significantly stronger than ferocity. Similarly to the Berserker example, expertise buffs the big pie portion of condi damage, whereas ferocity buffs the little pie slice of power damage. That said, there are times when you could change your rune set around to add more expertise from the runes, which means you may not need as many pieces of Viper gear and could theoretically add Grievers. But in these cases, Sinister usually beats it out due to the higher condition damage stat. So these are the two huge community misconceptions about using Grieving stats. What are the conditions that make it good? Well, first, you want to use it as a replacement for Sinister gear in a condi build. At the very most basic level, if there is a build currently using Sinister gear, you could swap the Sinister gear for Grieving. Would that actually be an improvement? Well, that actually depends on the next factor. You must have a high crit chance. The benefit of Grieving compared to Sinister is that you trade away a bit of condi damage and precision to gain a lot of power and a lot of ferocity. To get an advantage from the ferocity, you need to be able to have a very high crit chance. That usually means having traits that boost your crit chance like Guardian does in Radiance. If your crit chance is low, you won't crit as often, and every hit you do that doesn't crit is wasted stats in a very literal way. And thirdly, your build needs to make at least 20% of its damage pie come from power. How do you know if this is the case? Using Arc DPS, you can look at the DPS log of your build from a time that you killed the DPS golem, and you can see the ratio of power to condition damage that you did in the log. If the power damage is 20% or higher, you can probably consider Grieving stats might be an improvement over Sinister. It helps when your condi weapon has good power damage. For example, many firebrands are using Scepter. Scepter is normally a power-based weapon that doesn't even inflict conditions as part of its base kit, so for a condi build, it will have a higher than normal amount of power damage. The opposite end of the spectrum would be Scepter on Necromancer, which has a very, very low power damage. Even if Necro somehow didn't need the expertise in its build, Grieving would still probably be a bad idea compared to Sinister because the Scepter on Necro has such low power coefficients. So these are the do's and don'ts of Grieving stats. What builds out there currently could use them? If you've noticed, I've referenced Firebrand and Guardian as having several attributes that lend itself to Grieving stats, which makes it no surprise that many players are using Grieving stats on DPS Firebrand. It also bears mentioning that when Firebrand DPS is finally toned down, which it was sort of a little bit last night in the patch, the Condi portion of the build will decrease and the power portion will rise, relatively speaking, to make Grieving an even better option. Additionally, Condi Tempest or Condi Weaver is a candidate for Grieving, though not nearly as good since their power coefficients are much lower and the crit chance is much lower. The TLDR, for now anyway, is that DPS Firebrand is the only realistic chance for Grieving stats in the meta, since it checks all the boxes in the do category and doesn't fail any of the don'ts. Thank you guys for watching. I hope this was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below. And I will see you guys next time.